Now, that was an excerpt of Fear and Loathing in South Africa, a documentary by the BBC that highlights xenophobic attacks in South Africa.
You said you hate foreigners.
Most of them are selling drugs. You can ask my son, he will tell you. I'm thankful to Dudula, because Dudula, that's the only thing that keeps me going.
Why?
With Operation Dudula, I have hope.
Since the airing of this documentary, it has caught the ire among a section of South Africans who view the documentary as a propaganda by the BBC to stir up hate among fellow Africans on the continent. Now, many have also viewed the documentary as a ploy by the BBC to awaken their low ratings around the world. This has been happening for a very long time. People are talking about it. And I really understand the ire and anger and the fuming of South Africans. It's their country. It's all they have. And so when they feel that the BBC do not tell their stories in the way they feel it should be told, they'll come out and call the BBC, and justifiably so. Now, before I continue with this subject matter, let me just state my disclaimer that I do not work for the BBC, neither am I on the payroll of the BBC. And so if I have to deal with this subject matter, it has to be done with the impartiality and the objectivity it really deserves. I love South Africa. I think they are shining light on the continent of Africa. They are trailblazing when it comes to human rights. And that is where our love actually form. And I love them for that. But I feel like xenophobic attacks in South Africa is becoming one too many. And it's time that we call out to the media, especially the media in South Africa, in terms of how it covers xenophobic attacks in a way that favors South Africans and not the rest of the foreign nationals, especially of African origins. And this is the issue on the ground. It's been happening for a very long time. And it's an elephant in the room that we've all ignored for a very long time. We're quick to always blame the Western media for telling our stories in a bad light or casting our stories in a bad light. But what happens to us in Africans as journalists? We have standards, we have objectivity, we have impartiality. Why can't we exert impartiality? Why can't we exert objectivity when it comes to telling these stories? We don't do that, and that is how come the international media or the Western media finds the loophole and come in there and tell the story. Or sometimes the victims that are caught up in xenophobic attacks do not trust the media in South Africa as really credible, because when they share their stories with them, they feel like the media in South Africa is not going to tell their stories in a way they want the stories to be told, especially if you are not a South African. And so they will always run to international media. They will always run to the Western media to tell their stories for us. And that's how come the international media is doing the bidding for these foreign nationals of other African origins. And South Africans feel like, these stories that the BBC is telling is just propaganda. It's just a ploy to deal with their ratings. Now, the BBC cannot tell their stories. BBC is always casting South Africa in a bad light. I feel like the BBC would not do that if we have journalists in South Africa that are really passionate, that are really objective, that are really impartial in telling the stories that really need to be told. Let's give equal opportunity to people who have been caught up in xenophobic attacks to tell their story. Let's give them the platform to share their story, share their grief, and give them the chance to heal and to move on. Now, let's face it, South Africa has a long-standing history when it comes to xenophobic attacks. This is not the first time it's happened. It happened in 2015, and we heard of some in 2022. And these things happen all the time. And especially my ire or my anger is about the media in South Africa and how it covers xenophobic attacks. It's really worrying. The media in South Africa, especially the mainstream digital media, has been implicated several times for inciting anti-immigrant violence through inflammatory and sensational reporting in South Africa all the time. And in fact, towards the ending of 2021 and the beginning of 2022, it was widely reported that there was a surge in hate speech against foreign nationals of African origin by politicians and right-wing group in South Africa. And at the heart of this coverage was the Daily Sun, biggest media in South Africa. And that coverage they did was viewed as negative. It was viewed as very biased. It was viewed as unanalytical. And that's the problem we have all the time. And that is the reviews we have all the time when the South African media covers xenophobic attacks. We don't have true representation. We don't have even representation of the actualities on the ground. And that's the only reason why the Western media, or say the BBC, would come in to do your job for you. The BBC is coming in to do the job for you because you, the journalist in South Africa, are allowing your biases to cloud your judgment, to cloud your story. We're not seeing clinical objectivity when it comes to telling the stories. And that's the only way the BBC finds a loophole, seeps in, and do the stories for you. Do the stories for you. And that's become really worrying. And it's always quick to blame the Western media and blame BBC for not doing the stories right, and trying to drive an agenda of hate among fellow Africans. But ask yourself, you the South African journalist, or you the media in South Africans, are you being fair in terms of how you treat other foreign nationals of African origin, in terms of how you represent them in your stories? No. Sometimes when these xenophobic attacks happens, you lump up all the individuals who have been caught up and say that some of them are criminals. Meanwhile, there are people in South Africa who legitimately have their jobs and were caught up in xenophobic attacks. But when the reporting happens, they are all lumped up as criminals, which is really bad. And so when they run to you and you're not telling their stories in a credible and a fair way, the only option they have is to run to the BBC. Now, when these things happen, some of these foreign nationals of African origins, they do not have the media in their country come to South Africa to tell their stories. So all the time, we don't have fair representation for them. And so the only time they see fair representation, the only time they feel like their stories will be heard and someone will pay an ear to them, is when they run to the BBC or they run to any Western media to tell their stories for them. So I think that first and foremost, you, the media in South Africa, need to hold yourself accountable. You need to do right by yourself. You need to be responsible in the coverage of these issues. When it happens, let's see the fair representation of the numbers. When 54 people are caught up in xenophobic attacks, don't come and tell us that it's just 20 people. That's not fair representation. That's not objective journalism. We don't see balanced editorial work when it comes to the media in terms of how they cover xenophobic attacks. And media in other countries on the continent of Africa may not have the luxury to come to South Africa to get a fair representation of the stories. The BBC has the funds, they have the budget, and so they'll travel there to do the stories. And so let's not be quick to call them out when they do documentaries like this about xenophobic attacks. It's simply because the people who are in South Africa who bear the brunt of this half-baked journalism in South Africa in terms of how their actualities are represented, they tend to see the BBC as their last resort. They run to the BBC for refuge. They run to the BBC for solace because they know that the BBC will tell their stories for them. They can't rely on the media in South Africa to do the story without being biased. And so, yes, we understand how you feel. We understand your pain. We understand your fuming. We understand the rage. But first and foremost, let's do right by ourselves. Let's still go back for the ethics of journalism, objectivity, impartiality, telling the stories in a way that reflects the situation on the ground, that is really authentic to these individuals who suffer xenophobic attacks. When we do that, then we cannot blame the Western media for coming and twisting the story or telling the stories in a way that casts South Africa in a bad light. Let's do our homework first. Let's go back to the drawing board, learn the ethics of journalism. Let's be objective. We shouldn't allow biases to cloud our judgment in terms of telling the stories. When it happens like that, then the Western media will continue to tell the stories and we do not have a choice. Well, my name is Fritz Amegashie. I'm a journalist and a storyteller in Ghana. I'm really passionate about human rights issues. You can also connect with me. Facebook, Fritz Amegashie. On X is Fritz_Delano. On Instagram is Fritz_Delano. Let's keep the conversations going. To the South Africans in the comment section, I really love you. I love your country, and this is not coming from a place of malice or a place of spite or disgust. I love the country, and I feel like the media can rise up. The media, we have brilliant journalists in South Africa who can tell proper stories, human stories. And I feel like when it comes to xenophobic attacks, there's a deficit, and we really need to do right by ourselves. Do you have a good one? And cheers.